In the last part, which more or less served as an introduction to the series, I tried my best to give a concrete definition of the corporate system, while taking into account the numerous variations of corporatism that do exist. In the video, I also went through a short summary of corporatism throughout history and how it evolved. But, as I said, it was extremely brief, and I believe that in order to understand corporatism in its entirety, one also has to understand its origins and how it came to be in the first place. For a good while, and I believe this is also the case for many of you, I believe that corporatism came to be from Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum from 1891. But as I researched more about corporatism, I found out that Rerum Novarum didn't invent corporatism, rather it redefined it as a full-fledged ideology in the late 19th century. The idea of a corporate, organic, integralist and functionally organized society has been around for a very long time. In Western tradition, it goes back to ancient Greece, Rome and the Bible, the very founding and main pillars of Western civilization. And this is what I want to explore in today's video, taking a closer look at the old corporatist concepts in history and how they evolved and reformed, like for example taking a look at the medieval period, because corporatism was present in the structure of the medieval estates and society. I should emphasize that I will be analyzing specifically the Western conception of corporatism. While I did mention that corporatism can be found in Asia and Africa, I do this for two reasons. Number one, it is the tradition most of my viewers are familiar with and know best, and number two, it is out of the Western tradition that a complete corporatist ideology manifested. We should still keep in mind that this is just one corporatist conception among several, but it is one that I argue is the most important one. So let us start questioning what the origins of corporatism really are. As previously mentioned, the origins of the corporatist theory and socio-political organization in the Western tradition may be found in the very origins of Western civilization itself, the Bible, Greek philosophy, and Rome. Let us start off with the Bible. The biblical conception of corporatism comes mainly from Paul the Apostle in his letter to the Christians at Corinth found in the New Testament. Paul suggests an organic conception of society and politics, with all its functional units integrated, harmonized, and performing their proper function. Quote, "Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many." Now, if the foot should say, "Because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body," it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, "Because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body," it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as He wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, "I don't need you," and the head cannot say to the feet, "I don't need you." On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honorable we treat with special honor, and the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. And God has placed in the church first of all apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, and of different kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? Now eagerly desire the greater gifts. Thus, just as in the human body, the arms, legs, heart, and mind must all be interrelated and function like a well-oiled machine, so in society and politics, all the participants must be similarly integrated: religion and governance, economics and politics, lords and peasants, capital and labor. Ancient Greece, particularly Aristotle in his work The Politics, made a significant early and deep impact on the concept of corporatism. Aristotle held the view that politics and society are inherent advantages and have persisted through time, rather than being malevolent or contrived. Given this belief in the inherent positivity of political practice and governance, he saw no necessity for the implementation of restricted governance or safeguards such as those found in the US Constitution. Aristotle believed that society should be organized along quote-unquote natural class and functional lines, like warriors, the priesthood, slaves, and rulers. Quote, "And clearly, property should be in their hands, since the husbandmen will of necessity be slaves or barbarian perioeci. Of the classes enumerated, there remain only the priests, and the manner in which their office is to be regulated is obvious. No husbandman or mechanic should be appointed to it, for the gods should receive honor from the citizens only. Now, since the body of the citizen is divided into two classes, the warriors and the counselors, and it is beseeming that the worship of the gods should be duly performed, and also a rest provided in their service for those who from age have given up active life, to the old men of these two classes should be assigned the duties of the priesthood." Of course, today we no longer accept Aristotle's notion of a natural slave or ruling class, but his notions that a society should be organized along functional or occupational lines, on an ordered and bureaucratic basis, that each unit of society should perform its proper functions, and that all the parts need to be harmonized into an organic whole, would prove to be very attractive to future corporatist writers as well as political leaders. Lastly, we turn to the third influential source, Rome. Roman political thinkers expanded upon Greek ideas, such as the organic theory of state and society, while also introducing their unique concepts. Unlike the Greeks, who maintained direct citizen involvement in their compact city-states, the vast Roman Empire implemented a system of indirect representation organized by groups. This system closely mirrors, if not replicates, the example I demonstrated in the previous video, allocating a certain number of seats to the military, religious representatives, and so forth. Rome had a much more elaborate and organized system of corporate and societal associations, with a variety of military, professional, and religious institutions, which were often called collegios. Each had their own charter. These groups were usually monopolistic in character, but the state exercised control over and governed the relations between them. In the biblical, Greek, and Roman conceptions, therefore, we can already find most of the ingredients of 20th century corporatism. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century and its subsequent overtaking by so-called barbarians, there was a regression in social and economic structures to a simpler state. The central political power dissolved, leading to the emergence of smaller local entities. This era is commonly referred to as the Dark Ages. Historians often divide the Middle Ages into two subcategories: the Dark Middle Ages, from the fall of Rome through the 10th century, and the High Middle Ages, from the 11th century through the 15th. It is the High Middle Ages I will be mainly focusing on here, but even during the earlier period, we can see some ingredients that will go into the later corporatist philosophy. The idea that property has a social function and was to be used for the good of all, the nascent theory of a just price and fair wage, the principle of an uneven hierarchy of laws and persons, and so forth. In Western Europe, this corporatist conception now gained a Christian form from the dominant religious beliefs at the time. This is why, for example, the relations of seller and buyer, employer and employee, were supposed to be governed not by conflict and the impersonal market, but by Christian notions of brotherhood and just price. Now, during the Middle Ages, large social and political organizations began to reappear, as well as new interpretations on previous systems. For example, the new religious reorganization spearheaded by the Roman Catholic Church, the appearance of universities, but it is the appearance of artisan and craft guilds that is really intriguing, with their hierarchical systems of apprentices, journeymen, and master craftsmen. The guilds licensed and policed their own members, helped regulate trade and prices, and were essentially self-governing professional associations that helped provide both for progress and social peace. It is to the guild system that later corporatist writers often looked for a model of efficient economic management and class collaboration. Today, as you journey across Europe, remnants of the medieval corporatist system and guilds are still visible. You'll notice streets dedicated to special crafts, like silver artisans, goldsmiths, and various professional or functional groups. Each group is distinguished by its unique flag and uniform, regulates its own membership, and occupies a distinct position in the social hierarchy. This medieval corporate group system ran parallel to, overlapped with, and often encompassed the system of medieval estates, with which we are more familiar with. The estate system consisted of the primary estate, the nobles, the second estate, the clergy, and finally the third estate, the common people. This also was a system based on hierarchy, rank, and special privileges. But in many countries, the structure of society was more complicated, as can be seen in this graph. It had 3 estates, organized in terms of hierarchical class layers, plus such corporate groups organized along vertical lines as the military orders, towns, and so on. The clergy was both an estate and a functional organization. Medieval society was often thus cross-cut by both class and functional or corporatist divisions. But eventually, as I described in the last part, it would come to a conflict between the corporate groups and the central government, and this was especially the case because of the centralizing tendencies of several emerging monarchies. So in Europe, the earliest notions of limited government and checks and balances revolved around these notions of corporate group rights serving as a countervailing power to royal absolutism. The French Revolution of 1789 was one of the turning points in history. Not only did it overthrow the French monarchy and instill the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but also it swept away the guilds and corporative privileges of the many groups. Henceforth, it would be individual rights that would receive priority, not so much the corporate or group rights of the past. For quite some time, those who resisted the emerging emphasis on individual rights and yearned for a revival of the traditional corporatist system were predominantly reactionaries. This corporatist framework was viewed as an antiquated and obsolete notion from the old regime, firmly rooted in reactionary ideology. But not all those who were nostalgic for the old system were reactionaries. Many moderates and thoughtful scholars of society, such as French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville and German philosopher Friedrich Hegel, worried that casting off corporatist organization and the bands that tie society together would result in national disintegration. In fact, this is what happened in many European countries from the time of the French Revolution until politics started slowly stabilizing around the 1850s. Until the mid-19th century, the defenders of corporatism were largely in the reactionary camp, but beginning in the 1850s, a more realistic and even progressive form and ideology of corporatism began to come to fruition. It just needed a benefactor to quote-unquote catapult it into modernity and study, and that benefactor would come in the form of the papacy. You see, the Catholic Church sought to find a formula that gave social and economic justice to the rising working class, which was rapidly growing due to industrialization. But the Church also wanted to avoid class conflict, revolution, or societal breakdown, which was being propagated by another working class movement, Marxist socialism, and corporatism provided a formula for doing that. For this reason, Pope Leo XIII charged a commission of theologians and social thinkers to study this new ideology and movement in relation to Catholic social teachings. They would meet at the German University of Freiburg in 1884, and that is when they would come up with the first official definition of corporatism. Quote, "A system of social organization that has at its base the grouping of men according to the community of their natural interests and social functions. And as true and proper organs of the state, they direct and coordinate labor and capital in matters of common interest." Note in this definition that corporatism is now a system of social organization, that it emphasizes community and groups of people according to their natural interests and societal functions, that the corporate bodies that oversee these processes are agencies of the state, and that their role is to coordinate labor and capital in the common interest. Corporatism was no longer considered a remnant of an old oppressive system, but emerging as a full-fledged political program and ideology in the modern era. The papal encyclical Rerum Novarum, also sometimes called the Working Man's Encyclical, gave dignity to labor and gave the blessings of the Church for the first time to organized trade unions. It also indicated that organized labor now had to be recognized as a legitimate social movement and incorporated into the political process. But it was with corporatism, not liberalism or socialism, that the papacy intended to achieve these goals. By today's standards, corporatism was not a very radical movement, but in the context of the 19th century, it was fairly progressive. Corporatism advocated for workers to be incorporated into the political process rather than suppressed. It also changed the old paternalistic attitudes towards workers and unions, that it was okay to have them, but that they should be under the control and run by the quote-unquote better people. Now, it advocated for workers to organize their own trade unions, independent of owners and managers. Corporatism had clearly come a long way since the early 19th century. The interwar period between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II would be the highest point of corporatism in Europe. World War I had revealed the fragility of parliamentary institutions and regimes, and the Great Depression made people lose more faith in their liberal governments, and the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, with its anti-capitalist and anti-religious action, severely frightened people throughout Europe, and made corporatism look like a viable alternative. Several states in Europe started adopting and experimenting with their own forms of corporatism. But along with this, we see a sort of schism happening in the corporatist idea, and in the end, two kinds of corporatisms would dominate the interwar period: classical corporatism and fascist corporatism. Governments like Salazar's Portugal, Engelbert Dollfuss's Austria, Antanas Smetona's Lithuania, and so forth, they all adopted the classical corporate system that was rooted in Catholic social teachings and advocated by the papacy, and they tried their best to maintain the corporate system laid out in the late 19th century. Fascist corporatism, on the other hand, as seen in Benito Mussolini's Italy, was unique in the fact that Italian fascists tried to fuse it with another system called national syndicalism, advocated by the French philosopher Georges Sorel, which is a precursor to the fascist ideology. Along with this, the fascists secularized the corporate system and moved it away from Catholic social teachings, in the end creating a revision of the late 19th century corporatism. While classical corporatism and fascist corporatism both have the same vision of creating a corporatist society, their methods in achieving it are definitely different. While classical corporatist regimes have a strong state, they still offered a more lenient approach in the field of economy. For example, Salazar agreed for the economic sector to mainly stay private, with minimal government ownership, in exchange for the industries playing along with his regulations, or Engelbert Dollfuss making prominent liberal and free market economist Ludwig von Mises the chairman of the Austrian Chamber of Commerce and an important economic advisor. Fascist corporatism, on the other hand, prefers a much more direct approach in the economy, and has a much more totalitarian approach in all aspects of life. Mussolini's Italy undertook a lot more aggressive industrial policies and public works programs. But most importantly, fascist corporatism has a revolutionary zeal, seeking to create a new fascist man and society, while classical corporatism seeks to just maintain social stability and order. While both classical and fascist corporatism share some common features, since they both still aspire to create a corporatist society, they differ significantly in their ideological underpinnings, economic policies, and the extent of their authoritarian aspirations. Classical corporatism is more conservative, less revolutionary, and deeply influenced by Catholic social teachings, compared to the more ideologically radical and secular approach of fascist corporatism. Since fascism was both discredited and defeated in the Second World War, corporatism was discredited along with it, for presumably being a fascistic system. Following the war, most of the corporatist regimes left over from the 1930s were removed or replaced, either through revolution or by wartime occupation armies. For a time, corporatism as an ideology and popular movement with considerable mass appeal all but disappeared. Hence, in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, corporatism seemed to be in permanent, if not yet quite total eclipse. But then, corporatism and corporatist modes of interpretation were slowly being brought back in Western Europe. Although Europe had formally abandoned corporatism, by the 1960s much of Western Europe had come to practice a disguised version of corporatism, but without calling it that. In a variety of public policy areas like social welfare, incomes policy, economic planning, and industrial planning, a tripartite group of actors, usually organized labor, management, and the state, often got together to negotiate the shape and direction of the policy, and in the modern world, this practice is known as Neo-Corporatism. As we have previously discussed, these institutional arrangements and functions are at the heart of corporatist theory and practice. It may not have been called that, but corporatism is in fact what it was. It is like the old saying about ducks. If it looks, acts, and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. Even a handful of scholars from the 60s began to call these practices as what they were: corporatism. But it definitely was not the same type of corporatism as seen in fascism or other non-fascist regimes. This time it was being adopted by developed democratic countries and integrated into the democratic process and the more liberal market economy. It primarily chooses to focus on labor and business owners, at times bringing in other interest groups when topics like social welfare are put into the question. The discovery, or more accurately the rediscovery of corporatism in Europe, gave rise to a virtual industry of corporatist studies. People in the field of comparative politics were starting to examine it and trace its history, and alongside this, discover other varieties of corporatism in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And today, a lot of countries still practice the modern neo-corporatist model, as previously mentioned the Scandinavian countries, Austria, and even more developed countries in Asia like Singapore. For those who have been paying attention, you would have noticed that corporatism has constantly been evolving, from the old systems of the Greeks and Romans, to the guild and estate system of the medieval period, to the revival and reform by the Catholic Church, the schism with fascism, and finally today with a more democratic neo-corporatist model. Whether we like it or not, corporatism is here to stay, as history has shown. It will always reform and adapt to the current socio-political environment of the country or continent, and it is only a question of time when we will see a stage beyond neo-corporatism. It could be either more authoritarian or more liberal. Only time will tell.